hear me. Take yourself off mute and let me know in the box on the side.
I can hear you.
Okay. So today we're only in the office today, which we use the easiest way for us to do that. We're not hearing all of your background noise. Usually for the webinar, we have people in the room. I think we could just have you guys. So with me, and then my title is Manager Services at the Children's Treatment Network, Developmental Assessment and Consultations. I am going to take you through the DACS orientation. Asked to introduce yourself right now too.
Family Resource Program, parent of a child with ASD.
So Nikki and I are open to taking questions at any point in the, during the presentation. We have about 2 hours with you. We don't have 2 hours of material, and we find that, usually if one parent has a question about something, there are other families who would also have similar questions. So if you have a question about anything we're talking about, if we've used a term that you don't recognize, or we're talking about something you've never heard of, or you want us to go back and review something, just let me know. We're happy to take a second and answer your question. I'm sure other people would appreciate that too. We're pretty casual, so don't feel like you have to be formal in terms of what you're asking, and there's no no bad questions. So I'm going to briefly talk about our agenda for the day. And for anyone who has just joined us, I can see a few people added. If you can just mute yourself so that we don't hear your background noise. And then if you have a question or want to say anything, want to make a statement, then you can just unmute yourself. And if you're not sure how to mute yourself, just up in the very top of your screen, you should get a little taskbar that will give you the option of muting yourself or unmuting. Or when you see yourself on the side there, you can, if you go to the top right corner of your own, sort of the square that has your name in it, and go to the menu, the 3 dots up in the corner, it'll give you the option of muting yourself. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what we assess at DACS, what the DACS team primarily assesses for, why, what the purpose of the assessment is, who is involved in the assessment, who the team members are. We're going to talk very briefly about what autism spectrum disorder is, just very, very briefly. That could obviously be a full topic itself, but just to get us all on the same page and all familiar with the same language. Then we're going to walk you through, so the bulk of our time together is going to be walking through what the components of the assessment are. So what actually happens when you come, what's it like for you, what's it like for your child, and then at the end we're just going to wrap up with the next steps, kind of what happens after the assessment is completed. So what I'm talking about today is the A part of DACS, which is the assessment part. We have the C part of DACS is consultation, and we do see a lot of kids for different kinds of consultation, but we're only going to talk about assessment today. And the kids that are referred to DACS for assessment, almost 100% of them come to us with the question of whether or not the child has an autism spectrum disorder. So what all of you would have in common would be that your kids would have been referred specifically for that question. That doesn't mean that's the only thing we assess. So we do see kids where they come with a question of, does the child have an autism spectrum disorder? But they may also come with other questions. And some of the common ones that we get are whether or not the child could have an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is a pretty commonly known and understood disorder that is primarily related to difficulties with attention, but could also have a component of hyperactivity. It's a diagnosis that we typically don't make in very young children. So we see kids at DACS all the way up to age 18. And we often will see kids in that 6, 7, 8, 9 range, 10 even, with the question of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and the question of autism spectrum disorder. And you can have both. So we do see a lot of sort of younger school age kids that come with the question of, does the child have an ASD, and could they also have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder? The other one is a global developmental delay. So it's sort of the opposite of the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, in that a global developmental delay is something that we would look at in a younger child, in a child who's around 5, And it really is just a way of describing the child's development overall in areas like language, motor development, learning, daily living skills like dressing and undressing, feeding themselves. And when we see young children that are showing delays in a few of those areas, we would consider describing that as a global developmental delay. You can have an autism spectrum disorder and a global developmental delay. So a lot of kids with ASD when they're younger do have some of those delays, which is one of the reasons why we tend to look at both when kids are coming to DACS, if there's some history of a delay. Some of our older kids come with other questions, but these are sort of the primary ones that we look at. Any questions about that part?
No.
Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is why have your child assessed? And I'm going to kind of go over some of the primary reasons, and I'm going to ask Nikki to talk a little bit about that part too. So for the most part, our families come here because somebody in their child's life has expressed concerns about how their child's developing. And there's sort of two primary reasons I see as sort of driving that need for assessment, or that we think we could help you as a family. One is that the assessment process can help you as parents, and then everyone who knows your child and works with your child and supports your child, to have a better understanding of your child. So for me, that's always the primary purpose of assessment, is to really get a better understanding of who your child is, how their brain works, how they learn, and how they can best sort of meet their potential. The research is very clear in telling us that the more that parents understand their child's development and their child's needs, the better the outcome is in the long term for the child. So as parents, you have a lot of influence over your child's long-term outcome. And that's the primary reason we see for coming and doing this kind of diagnostic assessment. The other big reason why families come, and especially families whose kids are very small, are often, it's around access to service. So there are services that are primarily funded or aimed at kids with autism spectrum disorder. And without a formal diagnosis, those can be difficult or impossible to access. Sometimes within those services, the way that you would work on goals or work on things might be different if you know a child has an autism spectrum disorder than if they don't. Sometimes it wouldn't be any different, but sometimes it would. So it can help in terms of developing goals and a plan to address some of the concerns that you have about your kids and the things that you want them to work on. I'm just going to ask Nikki if she wants to jump in here to talk about sort of her idea of the sort of primary purpose.
Hi, everyone. So sometimes, as parents, especially if, you've noticed your child has delays, or if there have been struggles at schools, maybe in the older kids, and you may not even see the same sort of behavior, the same things that your child demonstrates at school, or vice versa. But somewhere along the line, your child has been flagged as needing a little bit more. And so that's sort of what brings you here. And the really important part is that when you're here for your assessment, just to be completely honest about the challenges your child has. Sometimes as parents, you want to focus on their strengths, or you want to think, oh, they do this a little better now, or that a little better now. And there definitely are times to focus on that, and those are things to build on. But when you come to the assessment, it's really important to just even think of your absolute worst day or your child's worst day, so that the team can get a really good sense of your child's needs. If you are on the fence, you may get a diagnosis out of this, and then you're looking at who to share it with. And it's really, in my opinion, not everybody needs to know, but if you're looking at, your child's daycare center or their school, their teachers, other people who spend a great deal of time with your child, it's going to be very important for them to know what the results of the assessment are, and if there is a diagnosis, so that your child can access the supports they need. What often happens if your child does have a diagnosis, but it's not shared, what tends to happen in the school system is that they won't be eligible for the supports that they would need to be successful, or teachers and staff get frustrated in working with them and they start to sort of pull back, and they don't want to go the extra mile as much because they don't understand, because they don't see the full picture of your child with the diagnosis. So as Karen said, it's, this is all sort of steps to this process, and the diagnosis can, help determine what services are available or what interventions are the most appropriate, and help your family to help your child.
Thanks, Nikki. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the DACS team here in York, because we also have a DACS clinic in Simcoe County, in Barrie and Aurelia. In York, our team is made up of physicians. So we have 4 pediatricians who work for DACS, all on a part-time basis, most of them 1 or 2 days a week. We have a group of, we call them clinicians, and some of them are speech language pathologists, and I'm guessing most of you or all of you know what a speech language pathologist is. Someone who specifically looks at communication. And our other clinicians are called occupational therapists, and our occupational therapists focus on things like child's ability to take care of themselves on a daily basis, their adaptive skills, we call those. They're sometimes kids with ASD or kids with developmental needs have some sensory needs, and we're going to talk a bit about that in a few minutes. Our occupational therapists also look at that. All of our speech language pathologists and our occupational therapists are here with us in DACS on a part-time basis, but they also do other jobs in the community. They're a group of highly trained clinicians that we train specifically to look at diagnostic assessment, mostly of autism spectrum disorder, and they're trained to use the tools that we use here at DACS to do that. When families come to DACS, the typical team that you would see when you get here would be a doctor, a pediatrician, and 1 clinician, either a speech language pathologist or an occupational therapist, depending on your child's age and needs. But there may be other clinicians who are working on your child's assessment that you might not see. So you're going to be asked to complete some questionnaires, and I'll talk about those again at the end of the session. And our clinicians are the ones who review those and who sort of score them up and look at the concerns that come out of those questionnaires and make recommendations. So there may be more to the team than the team that you actually see. We also have an admin team that helps support DACS. Christy Kuffner is the primary admin person for DACS, and many of you may have had contact with Christy either by phone or by email. And her contact information is going to be at the very end of our slide deck. But we also have a couple of other admin staff who support the DACS process. Patty and Sarah are 2 of our other clerks who do some of the DACS pieces, so you may also hear from them. This is a picture of some of the DACS. We actually are having a big DACS staff meeting on Thursday, so we're going to update our pictures because we've had a few changes since we've taken these. But these are most of the DACS team members. Any questions about that before we move on to the what is ASD part? Okay.
No.
Do you want to say anything, Nikki?
You get into the, well, you know what, I would just before we sort of get into what is autism spectrum disorder, everyone's pretty quiet in this group, but I know in a lot of the other groups I've been a part of, parents are sort of concerned. They're not sure if they think their child has an ASD or not, and they get a little concerned about when they're coming in for the assessment. So what I would say to you, parent to parent, is that I promise you that the clinicians, the team at CTN, they're highly skilled, and they will not give you a diagnosis, your child a diagnosis of ASD, if they do not meet the criteria. You're here for the assessment. You may or may not leave with that diagnosis, but what I promise you is that if you do, you don't need to worry that your child is just going to, be labeled with that diagnosis without actually meeting the criteria. And if your child does not meet the criteria criteria for ASD, then they will go over if they've met it for something else, or if they're not sure, and they will help guide you through the next steps in that respect as well. But I just want to reassure you that if your child is here for the assessment, they will do their absolute best, and they will not just be given a diagnosis just for the sake of it.
Thanks, Nikki. So someone is just saying, is it possible to make the PowerPoint larger? So you should be seeing on your screen the full screen with the PowerPoint. Are you not seeing that? Is it not the full screen? I think it's Amir who had asked about that. How about other people? Are you seeing the full, are you seeing the full PowerPoint?
Hi, it's Ashley.
Yeah,
I don't see the full one. What I see is somebody's screen with the whole PowerPoint with the ribbon at the top.
Yeah.
And I can see somebody's like scribbled across it with yellow coloring.
One. Okay, it's sharing the wrong screen. Thanks for telling me that. So let me just see if I stop sharing, and then I'm going to try again to share.
Thank you.
Is that better?
All good. Thank you.
Over here to drag the bar. Yeah. So now are you seeing it as the full screen?
Yes, I can.
I can see full screen now too.
Me as well.
Great. Okay.
I do too.
Thanks for letting me know.
Thank you.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what ASD is. I think, Nikki, that's a really great intro into this part, because I mean, one of the reasons why we love having Nikki here with us is because she can talk quite a bit about some of the concerns that parents have going into this process. I know that a lot of the families who come to DACS, their kids are very small, very, very young, and there's a lot of anxiety about what it means to have a diagnostic assessment of a child at a very, very young age. And there's concerns about what it means even for older kids and what the implications are. So one of the things that Nikki's really great at doing is talking really openly about kind of putting some of those fears and concerns right out there to talk about, because I can tell you I've been in this job for a very, very long time, and I've been doing orientation since we started doing them, which was at least 5 years ago. Parents often have very similar concerns. So if you have worries and fears about the process, there's someone else, there's another family who shares that. So that's part of what I want you to feel comfortable in asking us about today. And Nikki can really explain from a parent perspective kind of what that experience is like. And I'm happy to also talk about it from our process perspective to help address some of those fears or worries that you have about the process. That's part of the purpose of the orientation, is so that you feel more prepared and that anything that you have concerns about, we've talked about. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about what autism spectrum disorder is. And there's a big manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5, which tells us what the actual criteria for an autism spectrum disorder is. And I'm going to break it down for you a little bit. But essentially, when we're looking at ASD, we're looking at two areas of development. The first is social communication, and the second is restricted repetitive behaviors and interests. For any of you who've done any of your research, these are probably familiar terms for you, but I'm going to talk about more from the diagnostic side so that you know what we look at and the kind of language that we use in our reports and when we're talking to you as parents, so that we're kind of all on the same page. This is very brief overview. It's not in detail, but I at least want to introduce some of these concepts to you so that you're familiar with them when you come. I just also want to say the purpose of me going through this is not for you to feel like you can start to assess your own child, although I know for sure that a lot of you have probably already been doing that. It's kind of human nature for us to want to take that information and apply it to our own child. The challenge is that I think, it's very difficult for parents to be objective about some of those things. That's the first thing. And the other is that It takes a really highly skilled clinician to be able to really tease some of this stuff apart. So I'm going to just say to all of you, this is for your information and your understanding. As you partner with us in your child's assessment, it's not because we expect you to be an expert on these terms. So social communication is really broad, and there are 3 primary things that we look at when we assess a child's social communication. And we look at social communication according to a child's age. So we look at the social communication of a 2-year-old differently than we would look at the social communication of a 12-year-old, for example. And we also look at what we call developmental level. And what that means is that if you're 5 and you have delayed language, then we expect you to communicate and socially interact with others a little bit differently than if you're 5 and you don't have delayed language. So we take those things into consideration, age and developmental level, when we're assessing social communication. And we look at 3 things. The first is reciprocity. So reciprocity means back and forth. Any kind of back and forth. It means, when you smile at a baby at 12 months, you smile at a baby and the baby smiles back at you. You pretend you laugh and the baby imitates you and laughs in response. You roll a ball to a toddler and they roll the ball back at you. So those are early back and forth examples of reciprocity. As kids get a bit older, we look at, can they take turns when they're playing? Can they wait a turn when they're playing? We look at, do they take turns in their conversation? So sometimes kids with ASD like to talk a lot, but have a hard time with back and forth conversation. We also look at the emotional side of reciprocity. So if you're angry and you're showing that by your tone of voice or your facial expression, does your child respond to that? If one of your other kids in your family is crying, does the child respond? So we look at all the ways that we do back and forth socially and emotionally according to the child's age. For little guys, imitation is a big part of reciprocity. So little kids learn a lot through imitating other kids, and that's a form of reciprocity. The second thing we look at is called nonverbal communication. So that's all the ways we communicate without using words. And little kids, especially before they get language, or if they don't have a lot of language, typically would use a lot of nonverbal forms of communication. So those would be things like gestures. So kids with ASD are usually later to get some of their early gestures, and they usually use fewer gestures than typical kids their age, especially with delayed language. So an example would be pointing with your index finger. So at 12 months or so, we're expecting to see kids point with their index finger to show something, share something with the people that they're with their parents, with their siblings, to share in something, share their enjoyment of something by using their gestures. You guys can't see me, but typically I sort of demonstrate things like, come over here by using your hand to beckon, or it's really big by making your hands really big, it's really small. Those are all some of the early gestures that kids use. And kids with ASD often don't use as much as those, and they start using them quite a bit later than typical kids. The other forms of nonverbal communication we look at are eye contact. So kids with ASD often use less eye contact than typical kids. It doesn't mean kids with autism don't make eye contact. So a lot of people think that that's sort of one of the hallmarks of autism, that if a child makes eye contact, it means they don't have ASD. And it doesn't necessarily mean that at all. But it's one form of nonverbal communication we look at. And we look at how children use all of the nonverbal communications together. So do they use their bodies to communicate? Do they point? Do they tap you if they want to get your attention? Do they turn their head towards you to look at you when they want to tell you something? Do they look up at you when they want to ask you for something? We're looking at all that in a very, very detailed way. So the team looks at every sort of incident where the child uses their body to communicate, their body postures, their gestures, and their eye contact. The last area of social communication is called social relationships. So that sounds really broad, and it is really broad. It just means that we're looking at all the social relationships that a child has. And of course, we're looking at social relationships according to age. So when kids are very young, those relationships are with their caregivers, with their parents, with their grandparents, with the people who take care of them all day, every day, with their siblings that they live with. We look at when kids are in programs, if your child is in a child care program, how they interact with other children in the program, with their caregivers in the program. When kids are in school, we look at their peer relationships, whether they initiate, whether they respond to other kids, whether they can sort of go on another kid's agenda to play, all of those things, how they understand social relationships and how they manage socially every day. We get at some of these things by asking you lots of questions, but we'll also, for those of you who have a child in a program, we'll give you, or you may have already received, a questionnaire specifically for your child's teacher that helps us to look at some of that. Any questions about social communication? Nikki, do you want to say anything about social communication?
I was just, again, as we're talking about the assessments, if your child does get something sent to their child care or their school, and it comes back and the answers aren't what you would have expected or how you would answer, that's totally normal too. It's not unusual for children, to be different in different situations. Or, my son, there were certain things, there's nonverbal communication with me when he was young, his eye contact, things like that were different than how he was at a child care center or with a grandparent or someone else. So having things marked differently by different people isn't uncommon, and it's nothing that you need to be concerned about or think they've done it wrong or think you're not thinking of it properly. That's just sort of how it can go sometimes. Also, I would just like to say too, I think for me, and I know a lot of parents, we get so used to how our kids are that we may just find it normal. So it might take you a minute when you're doing the questionnaire and really think about it and think about what that looks like, maybe compared to another one of, if you have other children, or what you know from your friends' children or things like that. If that, your norm isn't necessarily the norm or the typical. So just kind of trying to pull that apart when we're assessing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, so let's move on to the second area, which is called restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. So this is a big category. And there are 4 things that we look at under that heading of restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. The first thing in the way that it's written in the criteria is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. So what that means is repetitive things that the kids do either with their bodies, with objects, or with their language. So for little guys, that means often repetitive ways of playing. Doing the same thing with toys over and over again. For some kids, it's lining things up, putting things in patterns, or playing the same sequence over and over again. For some kids, it's moving their bodies in a repetitive way. So that might be flapping their hands, jumping up and down, spinning themselves around, moving their fingers in a repetitive way. Also under this category is repetitive use of speech. So sometimes kids with ASD will say the same things over and over again, or say things in the same way over and over again, or they'll take little bits that they have heard either in a favorite movie or from a TV show or from a book, and you'll hear them repeat it over and over again. And sometimes that is their way of processing language, but sometimes that is more of a repetitive behavior. Just going to pause for a second because I think someone has a question. Would the set of PowerPoint slides be sent out? Yeah, sorry, you should have received the slides already. Can people just confirm for me whether or not they did get the slides? Should have received them in an email. Yeah, okay, so some people are saying yes, they did get them in an email.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you didn't, then can you just let me know at the very end, and I'll make sure they go out. But everyone should have received them. They would be in your email box. December 10th, someone is saying that they got them. Will it be recorded? We are, yes, we are going to record this session so we can make it available. So if you have someone else in your family that wasn't able to listen in today, then you could share it with them. Okay, so that's stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. So it's really just repetitive behaviors, something that the kids do over and over again. They tend to look a bit different. They're more common in younger kids than older kids, and they look a bit different in younger and older. I'm just gonna pause for a question again. There's a questionnaire in the mail. When is it due by? So I'll go over all the next steps at the very end. At the very end, I'll kind of talk about what's where you go from here. Second one is called insistence on sameness. So insistence on sameness is exactly how it sounds. It means some kids with ASD really like things to be the same all the time, or they like certain things to be the same all the time. And especially when they're younger, they often get some distress when things are different. So it could be taking a different route to school or to daycare. It could be changing something in your house. It could be giving them their cereal in a different bowl. Every kid sort of has a different thing that they insist on being the same. A lot of times it's insisting on a certain routine or a certain number of actions in the same sequence every time. Younger kids tend to do this a little bit more than older kids. And preschoolers, with or without developmental challenges, often like things to be the same. So some of this is very typical for younger children. They like things to be the same. They like their routines. They don't like change. It's sort of the degree that things take that makes it more concerning. And that's true of a lot of these things, that part of the job of an assessment is to look at the degree. But for a lot of kids with ASD, that insistence on sameness is really something that causes a lot of distress and upset for them. So it could be the reason why kids often, if you have a kiddo who's tantruming a lot or has a lot of meltdowns, a lot of times that could be around the insistence on sameness. We often will talk a little bit about, with families, about rigidity, which is the other way to describe this. So if you've got a kid who's really rigid, where you know that you have to do certain things, and if you don't do them or don't do them in the same order or in the right way, your kid's going to really have a bad day or have a very difficult time adjusting. It often comes down to their insistence that things be the same, or that things be done the same way every time. I'm just going to pause for the chat. Okay, so someone else mentioned they didn't get the questionnaire. So I'll definitely make sure to talk about all of the forms and that kind of thing at the very end. Next area is highly restricted interests. So this, sorry, just for anyone who just joined us, if you could just mute yourself, just so that we don't hear your background noise. And if you have a question, you can just take yourself off mute. So if you see your square with your name on it, your black square, if you go up into the right-hand corner, you'll see the 3 dots, the menu dots, and you can just mute yourself there. So highly restricted interests are typically things that kids are really sort of stuck on. Sometimes parents will say obsessed with. Don't want to play with anything else, don't want to learn about anything else, don't want to talk about anything else. Those kinds of things we call them highly restricted interests. And again, this isn't just about really liking something. It's more about really getting stuck on certain things. And also sometimes for kids with ASD, the things that they get stuck on or the interests they have are things that are a bit different or not so typical for kids their age. So sometimes it's that they're interested in something that typically a child their age wouldn't be interested in, that is sort of unusual. And also the degree of the interest is often more so than the typical kid. And for a lot of kids with ASD, they really struggle with moving away from those things that they are their interests. So you know, they might have a hard time playing with anything else, or, you know, people buy them other different kinds of toys for their birthday. They're not interested in those because they're sort of very focused on the one thing or two things. The interests often change over time. So your child's restricted interest a year ago may be different from what it is now. It's more the degree that the kids kind of get stuck on things more so than the interest itself often.
When you think about it as interfering with other aspects of your life. So it's not just like, you know, my son really likes backyardigans. It's just like he's so stuck on that to try to break him from that to do anything else causes him a great deal of stress, right? Or the insistence on sameness. You know, I have 2 kids, so, you know, maybe they both, you know, my daughter, who is typically developing as a toddler, maybe she wanted the purple cup, but I only had the yellow one. Well, she wants the chocolate milk more, so she'll eventually give in to the yellow cup. Whereas with my son, Brody, it's like, it doesn't matter. If this is not the right style of cup, if it does not have the lid he's used to, you know, it's like he could sit there forever, and it doesn't matter if it's his favorite drink in there. He really he struggles to use a brand new type of cup.
Yeah, and that's a good example. And I think I think a lot of parents often have questions about those kind of things, right? Because they'll say, well, don't all kids do that? And to a certain degree they do. And you know, part of, you know, what the team does is try to tease some of that out. But the other thing to note here is that in isolation, any of these things do not make a child get a diagnosis of autism. It's really about a sort of pattern, and it's about a pattern that really comes from a very specific sort of brain wiring that really affects how the kids process information. And what you end up seeing is a lot of these behaviors, but it's really more about kind of how they process information. And their interests may change, or what they insist on may change, but it's sort of how they process that information that is sort of at the core. The last area around behavior is sensory processing. So Nikki has been really great lately at reminding us that this is a really important thing to spend a little bit of extra time talking about, because there's not always a great understanding of how sensory processing affects us all, and definitely can affect a lot of kids with ASD. So you'll see in the slide, it says hypo or hyperreactivity. So sensory processing, when we talk about that, we're really talking about the things related to our 5 senses. So it's how we take in information with our eyes, with our ears, with our nose. And some kids are very sensitive to those things and can have strong reactions. And some kids are actually under-responsive. So you may see kids who cover their ears in response to certain noises, even if the noise is not very loud. And you may see the same kid not respond to other noises. So not respond to language, or not respond to when their name is being called. But they may cover their ears in response to other noises. We see sometimes the same thing with touch. So kids who really like to, you might see things like they really lean into you when they're sitting beside you, or they like to be really squeezed really tight, or they like to be wrapped up really tight. But they also have reactions to things like getting their hair washed or brushing their teeth, because that feels painful to them. So they may be hypo and hypersensitive to different aspects of sensory. Sometimes there's often a lot of stuff around food that comes into the sensory piece. So a lot of kids with ASD limit their diets, eat very limited number of foods, are very restrictive about what they'll eat. Sometimes that's related to smell. Sometimes that's related to the texture of the food. Kids who only eat things that are smooth or pureed, or kids that will only eat
Beige.
Yeah, color, could be color. Some kids that will only eat things of a certain color. Some kids that really like to sort of touch the food or smell the food before they eat it, because they react strongly. Some kids who like very spicy food. Some kids who like very bland food. So food is often a very challenging thing for parents to manage. And of course, food is related to, so much of our sort of daily family life, that it comes up a lot. But a lot of kids with ASD have sensory challenges that may not be very obvious. So one of the things that, parents are really sort of tasked with a lot of times is trying to figure out what is going on. So you might see behavior, especially in a younger child, when you take them certain places or do certain things, and it may not be clear to you why they're reacting. But one of the things to think about is, could there be something sensory going on? Could it be that environment is noisy, or the sound echoes in there, or that there's certain smells in that environment that they don't like, or there's, sometimes if kids have had one situation, one experience in an environment, like they've been somewhere at a time when the fire alarm went off, and that was so jarring for them that, every time you go there, they sort of cry, or anything like that, where you see behavior and it's not really clear, you might want to think about sensory processing, because a lot of kids with ASD have challenges around sensory. It's not all of them, obviously, but it's pretty common, especially when they're younger. Do you want to say anything else about that?
And I think just to add on to what Karen's saying, especially about the sensory piece, is I would just say to really appreciate that it is a real experience for them. So even if you're not totally understanding why it could be too loud or too smelly or too this or not enough of that, if it doesn't even make sense to you, that's fine. But it is genuinely real to them. And so whenever you're out somewhere, as Karen said, like if something's happening or your child's upset or they have a meltdown, really what I sort of call it just being a detective as a parent. So when maybe it's something new, it doesn't always stay the same for my son. We go somewhere and the last 5 times it was fine, but this time something's not fine. And he sort of, he puts the brakes on, he doesn't want to move. He puts his heels on, there's something. And I really have to stop and look, and I don't say anything, and I try to just be as quiet and as still as possible and really look around or smell, or cover your eyes so you can hear something. I mean, it could be even something as simple as the lights, the overhead lighting somewhere, you could hear that and I'm not hearing it the same way. So I think as a parent, if we can just get on board that this is a real experience for them, and then there are strategies for how you can sort of maybe build up a tolerance or work through it. And there's, as for all of these, with the restricted interest, insistence on sameness, repetitive motor movements, down the road, if this is something that continues to be a struggle for your child, there are ways to try to work through it. But just in the beginning, it's more important for as much as you can try to understand, even if it helps you to write things down, maybe when you're out somewhere or when you get home that night, maybe it doesn't make sense to you that day, but after a while, you'll see a pattern of every time you're driving to grandma's house, it's when you go around the house, there's a certain door or something, like this is where it starts. If you can track it a bit, even on your phone, make a note of something, it'll help you figure out, and then it'll help you come up with a strategy for how to help them get through it.
Thanks, Nikki. So I'm just going to go to the chat room to take questions. Is it possible for a child to develop new symptoms as he grows? Is the first one. So kids definitely change over time. All kids, typical kids, change over time. And what one kid might be struggling with at one period of their life can definitely change. And we certainly see that in kids with ASD, where we might say the research is really clear on some of the things that younger kids are more common in younger kids with ASD are less common in older kids. So for example, repetitive behaviors, repetitive motor movements are more common in children who are about 4 or 5 or under, where the restricted interest and the insistence on sameness sometimes comes a little bit more later, especially restricted interests. For older kids, when they sort of develop more of those, sort of obsessions, it doesn't mean that the kids regress or get worse in any way. It just means that certainly things do change over time. And what you see today, you probably can all relate to what you see today in terms of your child is probably different than what you saw 6 or 8 or 10 or 12 months ago. So we definitely know that. The other question is, when we say about being stuck in one interest, how long does it mean? For example, my son repeats making or drawing a volcano for 1 month until he finds something else. And usually these are inspired by cartoons or movies, especially if it's kind of an action movie or cartoon. So it's not, so for us, it's not really about the length of time that a kid is sort of really stuck on something. That's not actually what we look at. It's the depth of that stickiness. That's the concern. So kids with ASD have the tendency to get very stuck on certain things. And that is part of sort of how their brain is wired a lot of times. And that they have a hard time just being flexible and taking in new things and learning new things. And when they're interested in one thing, usually that's all they want to talk about, watch, play with. So it's not really about how long it lasts. It's more about sort of the depth. And like Nikki said before, we're often talking about how does that interfere with them going to school and learning about other things and playing with other kids who want to play with other things and play with other toys. And, we talk about the restricted behaviors and interests separately from the social communication, but they all overlap, right? So a lot of times these behavioral concerns can affect kids socially, because if you really only want to play with one thing and the other kids in your class want to do something else, or your cousins want to come over on the weekend and play something else, that can interfere with your ability to play with other kids. So it's kind of how they all intersect together, is one of the things we look at too, not each one of these things in isolation. Sorry, Nikki.
So I'm just like, there's a follow-up question about would they develop a new symptom? So for example, if my son has no sensory issues now, will he have it as he grows older? So this is the thing about autism, is that even if we have 10 people in a room whose children are all diagnosed with autism, and we all did the exact same kind of therapy, and use the exact, we did the exact same thing, it doesn't mean all of our kids would be at the same place at the end of 5 years. Everyone is so different from one another that it's almost impossible to say. If your child does not seem to present with sensory issues now, they may or may not have sensory issues in the future.
Yeah.
With my son's almost 10 now. So I can say, quite honestly, there are, it's kind of goes in ebbs and flows. Sometimes Brody's autism seems to affect him more severely, and sometimes it's like we're on a good road and we have things managed and we have the right strategies in place and we're able to, go a little farther, and then maybe we take a pause, and then maybe, something really bothers him again. It's, okay, we were getting better about haircuts, but now it's really challenging for him again. So there is no perfect answer to that. The best we can do as parents is to just keep our eye out and look for them. So when you see they're struggling somewhere, we can figure out a strategy to help them through it. Maybe those strategies can stay the same for years, or maybe I call it like upping the ante. I need to come up with a little bit more. It just depends.
The other thing too, I think sometimes depending on the age of the child, you may not know that they're affected by something sensory related. So you may only see behavior. I mean, it would be pretty uncommon for a younger child to be able to tell you necessarily that the noise in the gym at the trampoline place bothers them a lot. So even though they love jumping on the trampoline, the noise might bother them a lot. Every time you go, they might initially get quite upset. Once they're jumping, they're fine, but they may have a reaction. So that it's not always obvious that it's sensory related. As a parent, what you might see is behavior. You might see meltdowns, you might see refusal to do certain things, to go certain places. You might see, like Nikki said, a reaction to something today that they didn't react to ever before. And that could be because the way that their system is sort of processing things today might be different. I mean, it can be very, very variable. And in terms of, one of the other parents asked about does it apply to all situations? So she gave the example of a child who likes to play in the sand at the beach, but doesn't like to play with sand in the park or sand in the sensory table. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It could be that confusing and that variable. And I think back to Nikki's point around, sometimes that can be frustrating for us as adults to really get our heads around, because we think, well, if you can tolerate it there and then, why can't you tolerate it in other situations? And I think what we know, the research around sensory processing is really coming to light. I mean, it's really still evolving, but I think we now have a greater appreciation for how real this is, that for some kids, what they are, what we might just feel as, a touch, they would feel as painful. What we might be able to tune out and ignore, they cannot. And that when you don't have that experience, it's very difficult to understand how that can affect someone who is having that experience. So I think it's confusing, but I think what Nikki has sort of brought to our awareness is the fact that this is one of the areas that I think the more that you can understand, the more that you can then help your child. I mean, it's true of all these things, but I think it's often very true of sensory, because if you don't have those same experiences, it can be very difficult to understand them and know what to do about them. But it's really about helping your child learn to cope with some of these difficulties, more so than getting rid of their experience, which likely to do.
And there's certainly, clinicians or therapists, teachers you may meet along the way that can help support your child's sensory needs. But this is one of those things as parents that we really have to do the majority of the work on it to let them know what the needs are or what's upsetting to them, because odds are the clinician, they're not going to be with your child in all of these different situations. So you're really going to have the upper hand to understand how your child's affected by these different things. And when you think about the sand at the beach, it's not the same sand as we would use in a sensory bin for school necessarily, or at the park. It could feel different and smell different or look different. The sand at school, they might have bought blue sand, which totally throws your child off or something, right? So even looking for those little differences.
Okay, so just gonna give a reminder to everyone to please put yourself on mute, because we can hear somebody's background noise a little bit here and there. And then if you have a question, you can take yourself off mute. If you're not sure how to put yourself on mute, just look at your black screen on the side there. Up in the right-hand corner, the 3 dots, the menu button will give you the option of muting yourself. Thank you. And when you're on mute, you can still hear us. So sometimes people are worried, if I mute myself, I won't be able to hear, but you can.
There'll be a little microphone that will show up in the corner of your screen with a red line through it, and that's how you'll see that you're muted. Okay, so moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about the components of the assessment.
So we at the CTN DACS clinic, and most sort of developmental clinics like ours, we follow the Canadian best practice guidelines around the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And the best practice guidelines tell us that a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder should be made really based on 2 things that we then put together to form a judgment, a clinical impression, we call it. I don't really like the word judgment, but it's a clinical impression. So the first thing is developmental history. So developmental history, I'm going to go into how do we get your child's developmental history, how do we start to put it together, but it really is exactly what it means, the history of your child's development all the way up to today. And then the second part is called structured behavioral observation, and I'm going to tell you how we get that as well. We put all of the information together to form a clinical impression. So parents often ask a lot about, how can you come to this kind of conclusion so quickly? But we really have a lot of information that we use while you're with us, and then information that we've gathered before and after you come to help us to form an overall clinical impression. In terms of number of visits, the DACS process usually will take place over 2 or 3 visits. After, I'm going to wrap up, when I wrap up at the end, I'm going to tell you about the next steps in terms of booking, because after you've finished your orientation today, there's some forms that you need to submit, and then somebody will call you to book, and they'll book all your visits at the same time. So when they call you, they'll book all of your visits at once. The components that I'm going to walk through with you are the parent interview, the child, we call it informal observation and play, a standardized assessment called the ADOS, which I'm going to explain to you, and then our final meeting with you would be with you as parents without your child, and we call that feedback, and I'm going to talk a bit more in detail about that. Really important for you to know, you come to our office in Oak Ridges for all of your appointments. The address is 13175 Yonge Street. When you book your appointments, Christy will review that with you again, but really important to know that that's where you're going to come. When you arrive, you will come all the way, you'll come in through the back door, parking lot's in the back, or if you take transit, you'll come in the front door and you'll come right into reception. And the receptionist will take a picture of you and your child when you arrive, and she will give you that picture at the end of your assessment. She'll give it back to you. Parent just asked, only during business hours? Yes. So we only do assessments Monday to Friday, and we see primarily the assessments are in the mornings, and that's just so that we can make sure we're seeing your child at their best, and then we book feedback appointments in the afternoon. So developmental history, how do we gather developmental history? So the assessment really starts long before you come to us, and we get a lot of documentation from you as family and from the people working with your child who make that initial referral to us. And the reason we ask for all that information is because that is the beginning of our assessment. So the history part of developmental history is really important to us, because we're looking at how a child has developed over time. We're not only looking at what things look like today. We're looking at how things looked from the time that your child was born or very little all the way up to today. And often reports are one of the ways we get that. So you completed a parent questionnaire as part of your referral package, and we ask you lots of questions about your child's early days in that questionnaire. If you came to us if your child is young, you would have come to us through early intervention services and the York Region Preschool Speech and Language Program. We get all of their reports, because that also helps for us to see patterns and a history of how a child has developed. If your child is a little bit older, you would have come to us through your school board, and we would have asked your schools for any reports, assessment reports that they have completed. And the other thing that we do is we will send you questionnaires. So if your child attends a preschool, a child care program, or a school program, we will send you a questionnaire for that program. Many of you, or most of you, would have already received those. And those questionnaires really help us to see how kids are doing in those kind of environments. The other things that we ask for and that really help us to look at the history is a referral from your child's doctor and any relevant medical reports. So this is an area sometimes where we don't always get everything. Sometimes physicians are not necessarily aware of what we need and what we're asking for. So I'm going to list some things. And if your child has had any of those things, my suggestion would be for you to call your doctor's office, your child's doctor's office, and make sure they have sent us all of those relevant reports. So if your child has had any kind of genetics testing done, typically that's done through blood test. Sometimes your family doctor or your pediatrician can order those blood tests, give you the requisition, you go get the blood tests, and the results go back to your doctor. Sometimes they'll send you to a specialized genetics clinic for that. If you've had any of that done, if your child has had any of that done, really helpful for us to have those reports. And the reason for that is because there are sometimes genetic reasons for changes or differences in development. And if we know that your child has already had all of those tests done, we would not order anymore. We wouldn't want to have your child be poked again if they didn't need to be. If your child has any kind of history that made them or caused you to go and see a neurologist, that's another thing that can really, really affect child development and something that's really helpful for us to know about. So things like if your child ever had seizures, or if someone wondered whether they might be having seizures and you got a referral to a neurologist and a neurologist did some tests or saw your child for a few visits, those notes are really helpful for us, because that would be the other thing, is that we would want to know what's already been ruled out. If your child ever had issues with their hearing, if they wear hearing aids, if they ever failed hearing tests, if they had to have tubes put in their ears, if they had any kind of surgery related to hearing or vision, if you have concerns about vision, any of those things, those reports are really helpful. And if you have any other private, so someone's saying, I have all of the above issues, wonder how I get the reports. So you would just call your doctor's office. If your child's doctor would be the one who would have referred you to those things. And they would get, every time your doctor makes a referral to any of those kinds of specialists or for any of those tests, they get a report back. So all of those reports would be in your child's medical file at their doctor's office. You can just ask them to fax them over to DACS. Also, just a parent who mentioned that their child is adopted. We see lots of kids at DACS who are adopted. And so we know that the history is variable in terms of what you might know or what you might have. We will work with what you've got. So whatever history you have, whatever reports you have, bring them or ask them to be forwarded to us. But we do see lots of kids who are adopted where we might not have the full history on them.
If you do have some assessments or some other testing, things like that for your child, I would highly recommend start a binder right now with the copies in there, just so you can keep it all in one place for yourself, so that when you're coming to something, it's all right there and accessible to you, and then you can just share that with the relevant people.
Yeah. And you can always, if you have reports that you're not sure about, whether the team would be interested in those, just bring them. Like Nikki said, if you have a binder, you have a file folder, just bring it when you come to DACS for your assessment, and the team can have a look. We can make copies if we think they're relevant, and if not, we'll just give them back to you. But if you're not sure, just bring it. If you work with any private clinicians, private OTs, private speech and language pathologists, private physios, we're happy to get their reports. Same thing, they can fax them over. Or if you don't have reports, they can always just call us, and Christy can connect you with the clinician on the team who's going to see your child. And we're happy to take a verbal update from the SLP or OT or PT that you're seeing. We can do that very quickly so that you don't have to pay for a report. If the child has a sibling with ASD, is that relevant? Yes. So if you have another child in your family who has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, if that child was assessed and diagnosed at DACS, then we already have that report. But if they were not, then yes, it's very helpful for us to know that. For those of you who have done a lot of research, you'll know there can be a genetic link to autism spectrum disorder. Family history is definitely part of developmental history, and it's definitely something that that our physicians will ask you about, and we'd want to know about in advance.
And it is entirely possible to have more than one child diagnosed with ASD, and those children not really even present the same way. So it's not, they may not, the severity of the symptoms can differ from child to child too. So sometimes people get stuck that, well, my son does have ASD, and my younger son, we're not sure, but he's nothing like his older brother. It's really, it's not correlated like that. So any information is valuable.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, developmental history part 2. So all of that comes to us ahead of time, and the team reviews all of that information. That makes up part of your child's developmental history. But the next part of developmental history we get when you come here. So when you come for your first DACS appointment, you're going to come into a room with usually two people. One will be the doctor, the pediatrician, and the other will be the speech pathologist or the occupational therapist, who's going to make up the other part of the team. We typically have parents come in and sit at a bigger table, and the rooms will all have smaller tables where your child and the clinician will sit. If your child is a little slow to warm up or has difficulty separating, that's totally fine. You can have them up at the table with you until they're comfortable, and then the clinician will sort of move them to the small table. And while you're sitting up at the big table with the doctor, you and the doctor will have a conversation about your child's history. So they're going to basically ask you questions all the way back to your pregnancy or to the in utero history, all the way through their early days and all the way up to today. They'll ask you about family history. So if you know about other members of your family who may have any developmental diagnoses, they'll ask about that. And they'll also ask you about the concerns that you have currently about your child. So this is something for parents to think a little bit about before you come, because likely your concerns have changed since you were first referred to DACS, because kids change. They change all the time. So think about some of the history and what you're worried about today. Sometimes if you're a two-parent family, sometimes one parent may have a bit of a different take or perspective on both the history and the concerns than the other parent, and that we welcome that, which is why we always say if you're a two-parent family, even if both parents don't live in the same home, we really encourage both parents to attend the appointment, because we like to hear all the different perspectives. There's lots of reasons why one parent might have a different perspective than the other, and we like to get the full scope, but we also really need the parent who knows the most about the child's history to be there, because we are going to ask a lot of detailed questions. If you don't clearly remember all your child's milestones, that's totally fine. They're going to ask you sort of generally when your child met some of those bigger milestones. And for the parent who asked about having a child who's adopted, same thing. You know, we'll take you back as far as you know in terms of their history and move up to today. So don't worry too much about the very, very details. We don't need to know that they, walked at 22 and a half months, but the doctor's going to ask you generally, were you worried about walking? Did they walk around the time when you expected them to walk? All of those things. If you have a child that you think, really is going to listen in or understands at a level that it's not appropriate to be going through all that history with them, then let the team know that when you come. For older kids, we do separate the child from the parent during this history taking just for that reason, because we wouldn't want to be talking about a history or the concerns about the child if they're older. But for younger kids, they're usually very oblivious to what the parents are talking about. They find it boring and they're not interested. And I'll explain to you what your child's going to be doing at the same time, but we keep them pretty occupied. Just had two parents asked about English. Yes, so we see lots and lots and lots of kids where their first language is not English. So a couple of things that we need to know about your child that are very, very important so that we can do the best assessment possible. The first is we need to know what the first language is in your home. So what is the primary language that is spoken in your home? What's the primary language your child is exposed to every day? And then the second thing is, what's your child's best language? What do they tend to speak in, and what do they tend to understand best in? So we do see kids that have a language sometimes other than English in their home, but who go to full-time childcare or full-time school and have been exposed to English all the time and who do better in English, which means in those cases we would assess primarily in English with some translation. But if the child's first language and best language is other than English, then we will use a translator. We'll use a translator for the assessment. So really helpful for you when Christy calls you to book your appointments. That's a very important thing for you to make sure you let her know. This is our first language. This is my kid's best language. The other thing it's helpful for us to know is how much language do they have in their best. So if you speak Chinese at home, your kid's best language is probably English. Are they using single words in English? Are they using single words in Chinese? How much language do they have in each? Because that will also tell us whether we need a translator or whether we would have you as a parent translate the odd word. If they mostly speak English, but they have 5 Chinese words that they use, we wouldn't necessarily need a translator. If you're not sure how to prepare your child for the assessment, I would think about any other kinds of experiences that you've had. If your child went through the York Region Preschool Speech and Language Program, if you went through early intervention, you would have those visits where you come in. It's mostly playing for your child. They meet with a very nice person who takes out all kinds of different toys and plays with them. It's very similar to that. For older kids, if they've had any other kinds of assessments with any kinds of clinicians, it's not like testing, but it's more like playing, but with a purpose, I would say. So think about any other kinds of experiences, and I would explain it like that to your child. If you have real concerns about, if you have an older child and you really want more details to explain it to them, then I would suggest giving us a call and we can kind of walk you through some of the things that you might want to use as sort of starting points for those conversations with your child. So I already mentioned some of these. In preparation for coming in and giving that developmental history, think about your concerns, think about your child's history. Like I said, if you are a 2-parent family, you may want to discuss those things to see kind of what your different impressions are, or whether you're both sort of seeing things in the same way. If you have documents that you'd like to share with us, please bring them. If you have other children, we need you to not have them with you that day. So when you come, we really need to just see the child here that we're assessing. If you have a baby, you can bring your baby, absolutely. But if you have other small children or older children, we would ask you to not bring them, just so that we can make sure that all of our focus and attention goes on the child that we're assessing. If your child uses any kind of communication device or pictures or anything to communicate, please bring it. If they wear glasses, if they wear hearing aids, please make sure they have those. If your child takes medication, please make sure they take it that day. So if they take medication for their attention, for seizures, for anything, please make sure you medicate them as you typically would. And the doctor will ask you about that, but you can always initiate that too. You can let the doctor know right away, my child takes medication for this, he has taken his meds that day, or she. Please no toys from home. And the reason why we ask no toys from home is because it's sometimes difficult for us when we need to do some other things with your child. It's often difficult for them to let those toys go. And we wouldn't want your child to have a meltdown for that reason. So easiest if you just leave them at home. Just had a question. Should we send the documents before the first appointment? You can. You absolutely can send the documents before the first appointment, completely up to you, or you can bring them with you. The team is happy to get them either way. If there are really important things that you want the team to review before that appointment, then please feel free to send them over. You can drop them off here. You can fax them over, or feel free to just bring them with you on your first appointment. And we talked a little bit already about preparing your child. Nikki talked early on about just sort of how the parent report part of a developmental history, and some of the things you might want to think about in terms of, for a lot of families, this can be a difficult process because, you're going to these appointments and it can feel like the focus is really on the things that your child cannot do or that they struggle with. And that can be really disheartening to talk about over and over again and to focus on. And we understand that. There's often a difference. The research has looked quite a bit at parent report, and there's often a difference between what parents report in terms of their child's development and what professionals see and observe in a child. And that gap between what parents report and what clinicians see can be attributed to lots of things. So it can be attributed to, I mean, for one, parents are not supposed to be objective about their kids. Objectivity is not part of parenting. You're supposed to be subjective about your own kid. That's how you bond with them. That's how you attach. You're supposed to see them in a light that nobody else sees them in. And that can affect kind of your impression of some of their challenges or difficulties. Your own upbringing can affect how you sort of view things in terms of development, or what you worry about or don't worry about, or think is important or not important. For some families, you know, learning and academics are very, very important, and they're very focused on how a child is doing in terms of their early learning. Where in other families, you know, it's how kids interact socially and how they play that they really value. So that can kind of affect how you see things and how you describe your concerns. Your own upbringing in terms of, you know, what your own history was like in terms of your own struggles. If you didn't do so well at school, or if you were a very social person, you can often look at things from that lens. And the other thing is, if you have your own professional training in this field or in something related, that can also affect your impression. And I had said earlier, sometimes we see in two-parent families, we sometimes see situations where one parent sees things very differently than the other, which is just a very small example, gives you an idea of how that can happen. For me, I think that gap between a parent's report and a clinician's impression is typical and a normal thing. I don't see it as problematic. But what I think happens a lot of times is other people do see it as problematic, and sometimes parents really see it as problematic. And we get really focused on the gap. And to me, I think the gap is normal, but this is a process of us coming together. You as a parent who know your child in and out, up, down, top to bottom, front to back, sharing with us as much as you can, as objectively as possible, knowing that can be difficult. And us putting that together with our clinical knowledge, our years and years of clinical training and experience, and then putting something together that makes sense.
I think that when you're thinking about sharing your concerns, and every parent is at somewhere else, you know, at a different point at this time, how they're feeling about it. If you feel like that's going to be upsetting for you, then maybe just write them down and you can share that with the team if you think it's going to be difficult for you to speak about that day. Or if there's parts of your child's history, you know, if your child does come out with an ASD diagnosis, you are going to probably talk about your child's history and development over and over again for a long time. And so just being really factual about what you can remember, and please don't ever think that any of their questions are leading back into a judgment about you. It has nothing to do with you as what, you know, when you were pregnant, or what your delivery was like, or when they were a baby, or what your house was like. It's nothing about that. So don't feel that you need to kind of shine it up at all, or that it's anything to personally do with you. It's not. It's straight up just about your child and what they're doing. And the more real you can be about that, the easier it is for clinicians to figure out how to support your child or what the next steps are. Agree. I like to agree.
Okay, so let's move on to the informal unstructured play. So when you come, I said to you, as you parents will sit up at the big table with the doctor, who's going to start to ask you lots of questions about your child. And your child is going to sit at the small table, or if they're bigger, if you have a school-age child, they'll be in the room next door to start to play with the clinician, with the speech pathologist or occupational therapist who's going to do the assessment. Our clinicians take lots and lots and lots of notes. So you're going to see them writing all the time. What they're writing down is exactly what they see. They write down exactly what they observe, and that's what they review then after you go home that day. That's what they review as a team. The physician is going to write down what you tell them, and the clinician is going to write down what they see. Little guys will be in the same room with you as parents, school-age kids. And when I say school-age, I'm usually talking about 5 or 6 and up. Will be in the room next door. This part, the unstructured part, means your child leads the play. We follow their lead. We take out different toys, see what they like, see what they don't like, and they kind of lead. That is different from the structured part, which I'm going to talk about next, which is the standardized assessment. So we use at DACS a standardized assessment tool called the ADOS-2, and it stands for Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule. And it is a standardized assessment, which means that it has been developed through years and years of research, and it's normed, what's called normed, with thousands of children. The ADOS is still very play-based. So for your child, when the clinician is doing the ADOS with them, it's still playing. It's still toy-based, it's still playing, but it's more structured. And the clinician will move the action along at very specific times, and they will do very specific things and say very specific things. And they will write down kind of what they see your child do, what they say, how they play, all of those things. For preschoolers, the ADOS will happen in the room with you. And if your child is very young, the clinicians often like to start the ADOS while you're still doing the interview with the doctor. So it'll be in the same room as you while you're doing the interview with the doctor. The reason they like to start it is just so that we're not making the appointment too long for your child. For older kids, older is usually 5 or 6 and up, we usually will put parents behind the one-way mirror to watch the ADOS. Just because we find that sometimes for kids, when their parents are in the room, for the older kids, the ADOS is very conversational. It's lots of talking. And sometimes when parents are in the room, the kids will sort of look over at their mom or dad to kind of answer the questions for them, rather than sort of being themselves and answering themselves. So we usually have parents observe. This is structured. The clinician will lead the play, and they have very specific toys that they use and very specific ways that they use the toys that makes it standardized. So they don't have a lot of flexibility in that. It will still feel like playing for your child, but from our perspective, it's done in a very specific way. And all of our clinicians are trained to administer the ADOS in the exact same way, so that no matter which clinician does it, it is the same. It's the same experience for the child. Just for you as parents, a couple of notes around the ADOS, that because it's standardized, we really need to see what your child can do without your support. So this is our chance to really see, without prompting, without supporting, what your child really does on their own. So if you are in the room for the ADOS, we need you to just try to hold back on saying anything to them or prompting them to do or say anything. If the child comes to you, of course you can interact with them normally. And the clinician will coach you on that, but we just don't want you sort of telling them what to do or what to say. Even sometimes parents will even prompt for like pleases and thank yous, and you really don't need to do that. We don't take note of manners. No. So don't worry about manners. Part of the ADOS is a snack. So we tell you that ahead of time, because if you have a kiddo who has food allergies or eats a very specific diet, then you will need to bring something. If your child eats sort of the typical little kid or kid snacks, things like goldfish crackers, Teddy Grahams, mini Oreos, anything like that, we provide those. But if they don't, then if they're really restricted, then please bring 2 things. We need 2 things that we could give to them as a snack, 2 different things, and they need to be something that we can give to them in small amounts. So not something like an apple, but it could be something like strawberries or blueberries or things that we can give to them sort of little bits at a time. We have a couple of gluten-free options, but if your child is picky on their gluten-free snacks, you might want to bring your own. And we also put the snacks into Ziploc containers, hard plastic containers. If you have concerns about containers, please bring your own, but they need to be something that your child cannot easily open. We will give them a little cup of water. Yeah, I was just going to talk about water bottle. Yes. So if your child drinks from, if they have their own water bottle, lidded cup, sippy cup, anything like that, please bring it. If they drink from any kind of special cup, please bring it. And otherwise, we'll give them water in just a paper cup. Okay, so I'm just going to go back because I think I missed a couple of questions. So I'm just going to go back.
Your son may react different when we are watching him and stay there. He's 4.5 years old and he may not cooperate very well and tries to get back to us. If that's the case, can we stay in a different room?
Yes. So just let the team know that.
Oh yeah. If you already know your child will struggle with you in the room,
yes,
then just
tell the team. Just tell the team, you know what? You can even tell Christy that when she calls you to book. It's better, and especially at that age, that's not very uncommon. Just say he'll do better if we're not in the room, and she'll make sure that the appointment is set up that way.
That's great to recognize that too.
Yes, because parents do worry about that. Water bottle, yes. For the school and preschool questionnaires received via email. If my child does not currently enroll in any preschool programs, I don't need to complete. That's correct, Diana, but you should just let Christy know that, because she might be waiting on your questionnaires to be returned. So I would suggest is emailing back to that email to say my child is not in a program, and that way she'll know not to expect anything back from you. That goes for anybody who that applies to. So sometimes we need more information than what we already got in terms of all of that documentation you sent us, what we can get through our visits with you here in the clinic. And in those cases, the team may add on other components. They'll talk to you about those, and we would either do them at the beginning when we call you to book, or sometimes when we're in the process, we realize we need some more information. And if that happens, then Christy will call you to let you know. So some of the things we might need to do additionally would be some kind of other assessments, speech and language, motor. If they haven't been done before and we really need that information, we would book those in. Childcare, school observation. If there's a big difference between what we see here in the clinic and what happens in your child's program, and it's sort of difficult for us to get to the bottom of that, of why that is, then we would want to go out and observe. If that is the case, we observe a small number of kids. And in those cases, Christy will call you. She'll say the team really wants to observe your child at childcare or school. We have a psychometrist, behavior consultant named Sarah, who does almost all of our observations for us, although some of our other team members will go too if they have the time. So she'll book a time for Sarah to go and observe your child in their program. She really is just going to observe, just to watch what your child does in terms of their peers and the structure of the program. She's not there to interview the teacher or give consultation to the teacher. She's really just there to observe your child in another environment. The team will walk you through that, though, if they feel like they need that. What happens after you go? So after they've finished all of those pieces of the assessment, they come together and we call it formulate. So they meet together, they review all of the information that we gathered ahead of time, all that we gathered through the process, the observations, the history that you provided, all the questionnaires that you completed, and they review the criteria for ASD. And they review any other criteria that they need to in terms of any other diagnoses. And they write one report. So even though you've seen more than one person, they write one report. And that report will be ready for you when you come to your final feedback appointment, which I'm going to talk about right now. So feedback's always our last appointment with you. And when Christy calls you to book, the last appointment in your series will always be the feedback. So the feedback is for parents, and you don't bring your child to that appointment. It's for you, parents, caregivers. You are absolutely welcome to bring someone else if you would like. And for those of you who have an early interventionist, we encourage you to let them know when your feedback will be so that they can attend. They often will do that and can do that. If you have other support people in your life that you want to invite to feedback, that is completely up to you, So we're happy to meet with whoever. Typically what happens, so just so you're prepared for the process, the DACS team here has a report ready for you that day. And what they like to do is give you some time to read that report and then come in and meet with you and go through it. So they do, you know, if your feedback's booked for 1 o'clock, say, you come at 1 o'clock, they'll put you in a room on your own to read through the report. You can sort of formulate any questions you have about the report, and then you, when you're finished reading, they'll come in and meet with you. And they will then go through with you. They have things that they always like to review. They kind of just like to overall review the results, the process, and then they have recommendations that they make, regardless of whether they've made a diagnosis or not. They make recommendations. And then the bulk of the time is usually spent answering any questions you have as a family. So you can, like Nikki said before, you can always write things down ahead of time. Or, you know, if you just think of things spontaneously, then they'll go wherever you need to go in that conversation. It's really your opportunity to ask all the questions you need to ask. Every family is different in terms of what they want to get out of feedback. For some families, they're, you know, what the results are exactly what they were expecting. And so they sort of just want to move on to what's the next step. And for other families, they may not have been expecting those results, and so they may want a little more time to kind of understand how the team came to that result.
As Karen was saying, I think this is a really important appointment to just, if you can, bring someone. It doesn't matter if it's your EI or your spouse or your mother or your sister, but just bring someone with you, because I think even when you're expecting something or you think you're prepared for something, there's just something different in that moment at that table where it's nice to have another person there for support. And maybe you've already talked and they could even ask some of your questions, or they have some questions of your own while you take a minute, because you don't really know in that moment. Maybe it's that you didn't get a diagnosis and that's throwing you for a loop. You know, just there's no sort of standard thing. But I would definitely recommend bringing someone with you if possible.
Yeah, it's a lot of information. The team has a lot of information to share with you, and they try to do that in a family-friendly way, but I think it still can feel overwhelming for some parents, depending on where you're at and depending on kind of your own understanding of the results. So I agree with Nikki. I think it's one of those appointments where it's great to have a second set of ears and eyes, just so that if you miss something or you sort of hear one part but not the rest, that someone else is sort of there hearing it and asking those questions too. So one of the things that we have to do when we make a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is we have to write that diagnosis in a very specific way. And the reason why we share this with you ahead of time in orientation is because it's the way that we have to write it is full of a lot of clinical language that doesn't make sense to anyone else but us. And we don't have a lot of options in terms of how we write it. So I like to share it with you here so that you can kind of get a sense of what it's going to look like. If your child were to get a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder from the DACS team, they would walk you through the diagnostic statement for your child, but I just want you to see it here and get a sense of what it means. So we always will comment in that final statement on your child's age, because it's a pretty important piece of the information. And then you remember many slides ago, we talked about the two domains or two areas of development that we look at. One is social communication, and the other is restricted and repetitive behavior. When we're making a diagnosis, we look at each of those areas separately, and we have guidelines to help us determine the amount of support we think the child needs in each of those areas. And these are this guideline is really just about how the child presents to us at this point when we're assessing them. And it's not meaningful over the long term, but it's part of the criteria, so we have to kind of do this. It's not that we think it's relevant, but it's part of the way that we are expected to write a diagnosis. So you'll see something that goes something like this, that the child meets the criteria for ASD, requiring, and we have 3 choices, level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 would say requiring support in their social communication. Level 2 would say requiring substantial support in their social communication, and level 3 would say requiring very substantial support. So it just tells you a little bit about the level of need. Our assessment has shown us the level of need in that area, and then we look at behavior in the same way, the level of need. So I think one of the reasons why we talk about it here is just because I think it's important for us to say a couple of things for families, because when they see that level 1, level 2, level 3, sometimes families think that means something about how severe the diagnosis is, or parents will ask us things like, where is my child on the spectrum? Or they might think that that has something to do with what we can expect to see in the child's future. So I really want to make it very clear to you that this level 1, 2, 3 is not a severity rating. It's not meant to be about severity. There's nothing in the criteria that talks about severity. It's about the clinician's impression of the amount of support the child needs in each of those areas at that moment in time. So it also does not tell us what to expect in the child's future, or what types of interventions might be helpful for that child, or kind of where to get started. So it really just gives a snapshot of the diagnosis and what we see at that moment in time. But we would expect every child, and regardless of what level it says in that diagnostic statement, to change and grow and learn and develop over time. So I say all of that just to kind of downplay this level 1, level 2, level 3 part, because we don't put a lot of stock into it. The research there's not any research there that tells us that it's important, but it's the way that we need to write the criteria or the diagnosis. The other pieces we have to comment on are the child's language level. So we have to say whether or not the child is also language delayed in their language, and how much language they have. And then we have to make a comment on IQ. So we don't assess for IQ, especially not in younger children. We sometimes will do IQ testing in older kids if we really need it for the diagnostic process, but in general we don't. So we will make that statement at the end that the child, for younger kids, IQ testing is really not very reliable. And for kids with any kind of developmental needs especially, it's often not reliable until they're much older. Do you want to say anything about that, Nikki?
You know what, I think Karen sort of covered it, but again, just try not to get too hung up if your child does receive a diagnosis on the level 1, level 2, level 3. All of those can change over time. Different areas, different things happen. So it's not an indication of everything. It's a snapshot in time, and it's just your starting point. It's your first piece with your diagnosis, and then you start moving from there to figure out how to help your child in the areas that they need the help the most.
Okay. What happens after? So the DACS team does assessment only. We don't see the kids for ongoing intervention. The team will make recommendations based on the areas of need that they assess in your child and the areas of need that you note about your child. They'll make recommendations. The report can be fairly long for that reason, but they do a really nice job at doing a summary sheet. So on the front of your report, there's going to be a summary sheet that is going to highlight the challenges that the team noted and your child's strengths, and they are going to give you sort of their top 5 next steps for you and your family, so that you know, when you're opening that report, you might see a lot of recommendations, and it might feel like a lot to work through. The reason why they give you that summary is to try and give some initial guidance around what you might want to start with. We really encourage you to share that report. So that is your report to do with as you like. We send a copy of it back to your child's referring doctor. So that's really important for you to know, that the doctor who made the referral will get a copy of that report. And then you really decide where else you want it to go. But we really encourage you to share it. I think that, you know, I started in the beginning of the presentation saying to you, Nikki and I both talked about the benefits of an assessment, and those benefits extend beyond just you as parents. We really think that everyone who works with your child would benefit from having that kind of understanding of them and their needs and their brain wiring. And the risk of not sharing is that people make assumptions about your child that are not true. And I used to do, years ago, I used to do some school observations as part of the DACS team. And I would find, we'd see kids that were older kids, you know, 8, 9, 10, who were coming to the clinic for an assessment. And, you know, there were lots of impressions already about what was going on with those kids, because there were no answers about what the real struggles were. And so I think part of the purpose of having an assessment is for people to really know what's happening with your child. And the more that you can, as parents, you can share that information, the more that everyone around your kiddo can get on the same page and start working in the same direction. I think it also can help with compassion for kids who struggle with behavior. You know, when we have a better understanding of the fact that the kids are not doing things deliberately, that they really can't help some of that stuff, that it kind of helps us to be a bit more compassionate and understanding about some of that. So our philosophy in general is to share it. And I think Nikki said at the beginning, that doesn't mean you share it with every single person you know or come in contact with, but those who are really influential in your child's life and in your family life, I think it can be really beneficial for them to know. And if you want to share the results of your assessment, but not share the report, and you want to know about other resources that you could maybe share with your child's grandparents or with other kids in your child's class, or you know, people that you don't think necessarily need to read that report, then that's something, we have lots of resources that can help you with that, about how do we go about talking to the other kids in our family, or how do we share something with the grandparents that helps them understand why our child does or doesn't do certain things, and can help them to get on board too.
If I jump in for a second.
Yeah.
I think, you know, if you leave the assessment and your child does receive an ASD diagnosis, and you maybe are not sure how you're feeling about that. So I would just encourage you to do what you need to do as a parent to work through how you feel. There's no judgment on how long that takes someone, but just really work through how it is you feel on it if you're the one struggling with it, and get yourself to that point where you feel comfortable enough to share. As Karen was saying, I used to work in childcare. I also used to work for the York Region School Board as an educational assistant. And in both of those settings, it was so difficult to help a child if their parents weren't straight up with me. And weren't clear about what was going on, or weren't sharing information. No matter how much I wanted to help that student, there's only so much you can do without all of the pieces. So you're holding those pieces, and it's really important for everyone to see the full picture. I would also just add on, as Karen was saying, there are a ton of great resources that's on the CTN website also, sharing information with grandparents and other people in your family. And again, I would just say it's tremendously important for everyone to understand about your child, but do not expect everyone in your family to be at the same place in it as you are. Maybe you're accepting of it and they're not, or maybe they are and you're not. I think eventually it typically will level out for most families. But I know I spent a lot of time in the beginning after my son was diagnosed trying to get other people in my family to understand or to get on board with it. And it was a real waste of my time. I spent way too much time on it. Now you know, there are all these resources that you can sort of pass along, which is much easier than the way I tried to do it, was talking them through it. So just try not to get, you know, worry about yourself and your immediate family, but if other people around you aren't quite there yet, you know, point them in the right direction of resources, and then really try not to let that weigh you down.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the DACS report and the DACS team, when they meet with you for feedback, they will make other suggestions for things that you can access. So Nikki is here representing the CTN Family Mentor Program. And our Family Mentor Program is available both to families whose kids get a diagnosis of ASD, but there are mentors who mentor families who don't have ASD, so it's a broad program for CTN families. And a really great support, especially in those early days when you just feel like you need another parent to talk to. Often parents can provide advice and support and guidance that's very different than what we would provide as professionals. Sometimes they can give you the real deal in a way that we can't. And they also bring lived experience that we don't have, most of us. So often a very, very valuable resource that you can access at any point after you finish your DACS assessment or even beyond that. Same is true with our child and family counseling. We have a child and family counselor here in our Oak Ridge's office. Her name is Kim, and she's available to meet with families anytime. If you are sort of wanting to talk to someone, work through things, you know, maybe you and your spouse are not quite on the same page, or as Nikki mentioned, extended family, you know, how do I talk to my other kid, all of those things. How do I make sure I balance, you know, my own sort of well-being with, you know, doing everything that I want to do for my child, all of those things, self-care. Kim's here and available to you, and it's a really easy referral that we can make for you to meet with her. We have, for families who need someone to sit down with them to help them in terms of filling out applications for funding, connecting with resources, all those things, we also have a service that can help with that. If you come to DACS and through the process you start to feel concerned about other kids in your family, be they older or younger than the child that we're assessing at DACS, I would encourage you to talk to the team about that when you come to feedback. If your child is young, they can be automatically monitored. Their development can be monitored through early intervention. And if they're older and you have questions or concerns about their development and are wondering maybe if they need an assessment, the team can walk you through that. I'm just going to skip over the research slide because we're not recruiting for research right now. So I don't really think it's not that helpful for me to go into that with you guys. So just in terms of wrapping up, I just want to review the next steps. So it sounds like most of you would have already received emails with questionnaires for your child or for you to complete. Every family gets different questionnaires. So if you are wondering if I got the right questionnaires, you got the right questionnaires because they wouldn't all be the same. You get the questionnaires that you need for your child. Some of you would be asked to do something called a Vineland. And if that is something that we want you to do, you would receive an email from Q Global, which would have a portal for you to complete the questionnaire. There's usually one for a parent and one for your childcare or your teacher. If you are completing the Vineland, you have 30 days to do it. After 30 days, that link expires. So please try to do it right away. For our questionnaire for the preschool, childcare, or school, you can just forward that on to your child's teacher and ask them to get it back to us. When we have your questionnaires back, Christy will call you to book. So now that you've completed orientation, it's just a matter of getting your questionnaires in, and then Christy will call you to book. You don't need to reach out to her. When she gets everything, she will call you automatically. The clinic is booked right now. We don't book really far in advance. So we're booking into January right now. So depending on how quickly you get everything back to us, you would be booked into clinic within a few weeks. It's cold and flu season, and we know that kids get sick. So if your kiddo, if you take an appointment and the day before you're supposed to come to DACS, your kid comes down with a fever, they're vomiting, they're very sick, please call us as soon as you know that you're not going to be able to make it, because we like to fill those spots. We don't like to have the team here with no kid to see. We have lots of kids waiting, so we'd like to fill those spots. So it's really, really, really important that if you cannot make your appointment, that you let us know as soon as possible, that you call Christy. If it's after hours, leave her a voicemail, because every sort of empty spot means another kid who is waiting longer. So that's really important. And on the flip side of that, if you are available on short notice, you have a flexible schedule, then when Christy calls you to book, you can let her know that. And if something comes up sooner, someone else cancels, she'll call you to book it. She'll move you up. So that's really helpful too. Just give her the number where you can be reached. So that's all I have to say. And we have about 8 minutes left in our time together. Does anyone have any final questions? The very last slide has contact info for you. Christy Kuffner is our primary, sorry, Nikki? Oh, it didn't. I'm sorry. I just missed the slide there. She's the DACS admin clerk, and she's here full time. She's here Monday to Friday. If you have any questions, she's your go-to. She's your person to call. However, you don't need to call her, around, like if you've sent all your questionnaires in, please don't worry about calling her. She will call you. No, so someone just asked, do we call in? No, she will call you. She'll call you. So all you have to do is get your questionnaires back. She tracks everything. She'll know when she has everything back from you, and she'll call you to book. So you don't need to call her. You only need to call her if you have a question. And after you've been booked, if something happens and you need to change your appointment, then call her as soon as possible, because she's the person to ask. Any other final questions? Any feedback from us? Did you find this session helpful? Do you feel more prepared for today? Usually it's more challenging for us with the webinar because we can't see your faces. If no questionnaires I need to complete, should I just wait for a call from Christy or appointment booking? So if she emailed you questionnaires, but your child is not in a program, then please call her to tell her that, because she would be waiting on your questionnaire. Sounds like people found it informative. That's great. If my son has been working with a private speech pathologist, other assessments, yes, please. Yes, please send them to Christy. She's happy to have those. Or you can ask your speech pathologist themselves to send over. If you have someone that you've been working closely that knows your child, we're happy to get reports from them. Email address to contact her. Yes.
Likely she would have sent you your form.
She would have emailed you your forms, so you could just email her back. She's kkuffner@ctnsy.ca. Very convenient. Thanks so much. Helpful. How long should I expect to receive a call from appointment booking? So I would expect from the time when your questionnaires are submitted, within a week or two, you'll hear from her. So if you've gotten all your questionnaires back and it's been 2 weeks and you haven't heard from her, certainly reach out to her. But other than that, it's not unusual for it to be a week or two. Thanks everyone so much. Thanks for all your questions. You guys were really engaged even though we were a webinar. Where can I review the session again? So I'm going to check about that. My understanding is that we were going to tape today's session, and I will get Christy to send out the link for you guys to get the recording if you want to share it with other people in your family. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You guys were great, and happy holidays if you're celebrating something. And we'll see you at DACS in the new year. Take care. Bye.